or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 6, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you had a wonderful holiday. The highlights today under business and finance are: the war in the Middle East is diminishing the attraction of value stocks to cautious investors, threatening to upend the trade and leave those looking for a hedge with one less option. For all its drawbacks elsewhere, the war-induced oil shock has rewarded shareholders of U.S. oil and gas companies, transforming a flagging industry into one of the market's few havens. Exploiting the inaccessibility of competitors' raw materials in the Middle East, U.S. chemical makers have been able to raise prices of plastics and plastics precursors. Universal Pictures and Nintendo's The Super Mario Galaxy movie posted the biggest opening of 2026 so far, with an estimated $372.5 billion in worldwide box office sales. PepsiCo and Diageo pulled their sponsorships of a major London musical festival set for this summer after Kanye West was booked as the headline performer. Executives formerly with Grubhub are looking to challenge AAA with apps that put drivers in need in touch with tow trucks and other roadside help. Thousands of striking beef plant workers in Colorado agreed to return to work, ending a 3-week strike at a slaughter plant owned by JBS, the world's largest meat packer. OpenAI and Anthropic face a potential problem in the escalating cost of training each new iteration of an AI model as the companies race toward their initial public offerings. Now for the key articles under the worldwide section. Trump threatened to destroy all of Iran's power plants if the country's leaders don't agree to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by Tuesday evening, piling more pressure on Tehran. Transatlantic ties with the U.S. and Europe are deteriorating, with tensions over the Iran war adding to a sense that the world's most important geopolitical partnership is sliding toward dissolution. More aspiring lawyers are asking for and getting extra time to finish the bar exam, a development that follows one coursing through high schools and colleges. The new tax deduction for overtime pay is on track to be claimed by about twice as many people as projected when it was created last year, new data show. Trump is reshaping how the federal government collects money and where those funds are spent, while doing little on net to rein in federal deficits. A contractor is deploying fleets of drones to high school as part of state-funded programs to increase security and reduce gun violence. China reserved offshore airspace without explanation for a period of 40 days, issuing alerts similar to those that precede Beijing's military exercises, which typically last no more than a few days. The U.S. repatriated to China a Chinese fugitive suspected of drug smuggling, the first case of its kind in recent years. The picture on today's front page takes place at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, where 4 priests are at the altar. And that caption reads, "Rejoice." Archbishop Ronald Hicks led Easter Mass on Sunday at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. At the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV emphasized Easter's message of hope as a celebration of Jesus' resurrection after being crucified. And the headline, "Christians celebrate Easter's message of hope." Articles from the front page follow. Force, deception were crucial in U.S. airmen's rescue in Iran. High-risk mission occurred as hostile forces closed in on the injured aviator. By Vera Bergengruen, Alexander Ward, Michael R. Gordon, and Shelby Holliday. For nearly 2 days, injured and alone, a U.S. aviator hid in a remote mountain crevice as Iranian forces and militias closed in on him with helicopters and drones. God is good, the Air Force colonel had radioed once he reached an elevated ridge, a message that was initially met with suspicion in Washington as a possible Iranian trap, as officials tried to verify he was still alive. Early Sunday, he heard the heavier roar of U.S. aircraft and a barrage of fire as U.S. commandos reached him 200 miles deep inside Iran. As they whisked him to safety, they blew up aircraft stranded on the ground rather than risk the sophisticated military equipment falling into Iranian hands, leaving behind a final explosion and a plume of smoke. The rescue mission, U.S. officials said, unfolded in the craggy gorges of southwestern Iran, was the kind of operation military commanders both planned for and dread. A downed U.S. airman in enemy territory, hostile forces converging, and early attempts faltering under fire. The aviator, who hasn't been identified, had been one of the 2 crew flying in an F-15E Strike Eagle with the aircraft call sign Dude 44 when it was shot down by Iranian forces on Friday. Shortly after the plane crashed, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed President Trump about the situation, U.S. officials said. They told him the Pentagon had long planned for this scenario and could rescue the airman. Once the Pentagon confirmed the aviator's identity, Hegseth rushed to the Oval Office to tell him and seek a final order, officials said. Trump immediately gave his approval. "We have to get him," Trump said, according to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. The effort to recover the officer set off a sprawling, high-risk rescue mission involving some 100 special operation forces, dozens of U.S. warplanes and helicopters, and a last-minute CIA deception campaign to buy more time, the official said. Quote, when airmen go down, you can't get them in very tough countries like in Vietnam, Trump told the Wall Street Journal Sunday morning. He was able to climb up as wounded as he was. He was able to climb up into a crevice, the president continued, saying the airmen could hear the U.S. forces looking for him. A lot of great things happened. Troops led by Central Command brought a devastating array of firepower to keep its enemy at bay. 4 B-1 bombers, part of a larger air armada, dropped nearly 100 2,000-pound satellite-guided bombs, 2 U.S. officials said. MQ-9 Reaper drones also struck suspected fighters as they approached within miles of the aviators' hiding site. The search for an American airman stranded behind enemy lines jolted the U.S., making what had been an abstract air war feel visceral beyond the grainy footage of explosions released by the White House. It also provided both sides with a new narrative as the war enters its 6th week. The Iranian regime has portrayed the downing of the jet as proof that the U.S. could be bloodied and has challenged Trump's claims of U.S. air superiority. In triumphant interviews and posts, Trump and some of his allies have been calling the successful operation an Easter miracle, as the administration seeks to mobilize flagging public support for the war. When the F-15E came under fire on Friday, the aircrew pulled their ejection handle, which blew the canopy, blasted the seats out of the cockpit, and deployed their parachutes. Below them, the damaged plane crashed hundreds of miles inside Iranian territory. But while a U.S. military team was able to quickly rescue the pilot, the other crew member, who flew in the backseat of the fighter as a weapons systems officer, went missing. The news first broke on Iranian state television. Reading from a sheet of paper, a female anchor said U.S. air crew had ejected from a plane in southwestern Iran. The Americans were believed to be in the Kogalyulya and Boyer Amand, in a mountainous province of steep ridgelines. She urged all tribespeople and villagers to cooperate with the military and law enforcement. If you capture the enemy pilot or pilots alive and hand them over to the police, you will receive a precious prize, she said, with a backdrop of a military march. For the Pentagon, this was a worst-case scenario. It was the first time a piloted U.S. aircraft had been lost over enemy territory in more than 20 years, military experts said. Video footage of a captured U.S. airman in enemy hands would have handed Tehran a major propaganda tool and a source of leverage at a critical moment in the war. U.S. officials worried that the regime would use them to seek maximalist concessions. Trump was in the Oval Office on Friday and Saturday to receive constant updates from Hegseth, Leavitt said. Soon after the airman landed, he was able to get to an elevated ridge and make contact by activating an emergency beacon to send his proof of life, senior officials said. But as he went deeper into hiding in the mountainous terrain, communication went in and out as U.S. officials sought to keep track of his location. The complex mission quickly ran into problems officials said. The CIA also carried out a deception operation to throw the Iranians off their track. As the aviator hid from Iranian forces, the agency spread false word inside the country that the U.S. military had located the downed airman and were preparing to move him overland for exfiltration. After the mission was complete, the U.S. destroyed the two stuck MC-130Js, which cost more than $100 million each, and two H-6 Little Bird helicopters, so their sensitive technology wouldn't be compromised after they were left behind. After hours of speculation, Trump posted the news shortly after midnight. "We got him," Trump wrote on Truth Social. The U.S. military sent dozens of aircraft armed with the most lethal weapons in the world to retrieve him. He sustained injuries, but he will be just fine. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump threatens Iranian power plants. In an interview, President gives Tehran until Tuesday to reopen Key Strait. By Meredith McGraw, Washington. President Trump threatened to destroy all of Iran's power plants if the country's leaders don't agree to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by Tuesday evening, ratcheting up pressure on Tehran. If they don't come through, if they want to keep it closed, they're going to lose every power plant and every other plant they have in the whole country, Trump said in an 8-minute interview Sunday with the Wall Street Journal. The comments came hours after U.S. forces rescued an American aviator trapped in Iran. Trump, in recent days, has repeatedly escalated his threats against the country, which has resisted the president's demands and appears determined to carry out a war of attrition. More Americans Rise to Upper Middle Class by Rachel Louise Ensign. Randy Schilling went to public high school in Corpus Christi, Texas. He graduated from Texas A&M University with a petroleum engineering degree. For the first decade of his career, he lived in an apartment and worried about paying for vacations. Then, in his early 30s, he landed a job at a chemical plant that paid about 15% more plus bonuses, and life felt smoother. Around the same time, he bought a house on a golf course in the Houston suburb of Humble, Texas. Promotions and pay raises followed, and he saved more than $3 million for retirement. Almost without realizing it, Schilling ascended into the upper middle class. I view myself as an average Joe. I don't have to have a fancy car. I don't have to have the greatest TV, said Schilling, who is 58. But when I want something, I go get it. America's middle class is becoming wealthier as more families scale the economic ladder into higher earning groups. New research shows that the ranks of the affluent have grown markedly over the last 50 years or so, while the lower rungs of the middle class have shrunk. In 2024, about 31% of Americans were part of the upper middle class, up from 10% in 1979, according to a report released this year by the right-leaning American Enterprise Institute. UCLA Queens of Basketball. History a-brewin'. The squad won its first ever title with a 79-51 rout of South Carolina on Sunday. Now for other articles within the paper. NATO reaching breaking point over war. Europe sees Trump's insistence that NATO didn't help as unfair. Tensions mount as conflict worsens frosty relationship. There's no trust left. By Marcus Walker and David Ludnow. Transatlantic ties between the U.S. and Europe are deteriorating, with tensions over the Iran war adding to a sense that the world's most important geopolitical partnership is sliding toward a divorce. President Trump has expressed disgust with European allies for not joining the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, and he has mused with aides and journalists about pulling out of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the 77-year-old alliance that won the Cold War and, until recently, underpinned the West. For their part, European leaders have opposed a war they weren't consulted about and which they see as illegal and ill-advised. After a year in which Trump placed tariffs on European products, scrapped most U.S. support for Ukraine, mocked European leaders, and threatened to seize the Danish territory of Greenland, they and their voters are in no mood to help out. At stake in the conflict is the future of NATO, which for decades has kept Europe safe and allowed it to prosper. Until recent weeks, Trump's main complaint about NATO had been about burden sharing, that European nations weren't pulling their weight in the continent's joint defense. Now, with European members of NATO sitting out the war, Trump is questioning whether defending Europe serves U.S. interest if Europeans don't help American military interventions in the Middle East or elsewhere. The implication: the U.S. role in NATO is a favor to Europeans, and it needs a quid pro quo to be worth America's while. We would always have been there for them. They weren't there for us, Trump told Britain's Telegraph newspaper recently. European help with the Strait of Hormuz should have been automatic, he said. The White House's stance is a break with American global strategy since World War II, which has treated Europe's stability and security as a vital interest. European officials say NATO has always had boundaries. Its charter defines it as a mutual defense pact covering Europe and North America. Members aren't obligated to support U.S. wars of choice in other regions, such as the Persian Gulf. Aviation mystery arises near Taiwan by Zhou Wang. Taipei. China has reserved offshore airspace without explanation for a period of 40 days, issuing alerts similar to those used to warn aviation authorities of Chinese military exercises, which typically last no more than a few days. Beijing hasn't declared any exercises in the area, sparking a new aviation mystery following an unexplained pause in military flights around Taiwan. The airspace reserved in the current alerts is hundreds of miles away from the self-governing island. The alerts are in effect from March 27th through May 6th and haven't been reported. Formerly known as Notice to Air Missions or NOTAMs, such designations are intended to inform pilots and aviation authorities of temporary airspace hazards or restrictions. Civil aviation appears unaffected, though coordination is needed for aircraft to transit such areas. The reserved airspace has no vertical ceiling, designated in the NOTAMs as SFC-UNL. What makes this especially notable is the combination of SFC-UNL with an extraordinary 40-day duration and no announced exercise, said Ray Powell, director of the Sea Light Project at Stanford University, which tracks Chinese maritime activity. That suggests not a discrete exercise, but a sustained operational readiness posture, and one that China apparently doesn't feel the need to explain. If the zones are confirmed to be linked to exercises, the warnings would represent a meaningful shift in how Beijing uses airspace control as a tool of military signaling, Powell said. The zones reserved by China cover a total area larger than Taiwan's main island, including offshore airspace to the north and south of Shanghai, according to information available from the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. They extend from the Yellow Sea, facing South Korea, south to the waters of the East China Sea, facing Japan. Some past Chinese drills have focused on establishing control of routes that might be used by the U.S. military in a potential conflict over Taiwan. Conflict takes toll on value stocks. Shares trading at low multiples have led market this year but are now at risk. By Crystal Herr. One of the last places to hide from this year's stock market turbulence is in danger. Value stocks, or shares trading at low multiples of their book value, have quietly marched toward a banner year. Now the war in the Middle East is threatening to upend the trade, leaving investors few places to find refuge from fears over everything from rapid advances in artificial intelligence to geopolitical conflict. The Russell 1000 Value Index is up 2.4% this year, beating the Russell 1000 Growth Index, which is down 9.1% by the largest margin since 2022. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 index is down 3.8% and recently notched its worst quarter in nearly 4 years. Some of the stocks leading the value index higher are flash memory maker SanDisk, up 196% this year, Moderna, up 67%, and Acadia Healthcare, which has added 69%. But the gains for many value stocks are now at risk, with the escalating conflict in Iran roiling the stock market, sending oil prices ratcheting higher, and sparking fears of an economic downturn. The Russell 1000 Value Index has fallen 4.3% since late February, when the U.S. and Israel launched a strike on Iran. Shares of Nike have declined 29% over that stretch, while home builder Lennar and Southwest Airlines have each slipped about 24%. Shares of banks, utilities, and others closely linked to the economy, which often fit the bill of value stocks, have also fallen during that stretch. The wall of worry is under full construction, said Terry Sandvin, Chief Equity Strategist at U.S. Bank Asset Management. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, a daring rescue inside Iran. The mission is more evidence of U.S. military competence and bravery. Americans awoke on Easter Sunday to the brilliant news that a second American airman had been rescued from Iranian territory after a crash last week. This is further evidence of the competence and bravery of the U.S. military, which is one institution that still seems to work and deserves public trust. Details of the rescue are filtering out through the press, and one lesson is the importance of training and planning. The airman, an unidentified colonel, as we write this, climbed into mountainous terrain despite his injuries to escape detection and await a rescue once the U.S. located him. The military then sent in special forces on the dangerous rescue mission that would expose them to Iranian fire. That they pulled it off without a single U.S. casualty is extraordinary. The rescue avoided capture that Iran would have exploited for propaganda purposes. The airmen would have been beaten or worse, and paraded before cameras that the global media would have been only too happy to broadcast. Within hours of the crash, the press was already asking the White House press secretary if the airman's capture would complicate President Trump's war strategy. Instead, the rescue is a moment to celebrate a wartime triumph. It is nothing short of remarkable that more U.S. pilots haven't been shot down in the month since the war began. This testifies to the U.S. and Israeli dominance of the skies, even if the risks of a lucky shot from the ground can never be eliminated in a conflict. The relative paucity of American casualties demonstrates the care and competence of the planning by Admiral Brad Cooper and Central Command, as well as the skill and execution by members of the military. All of this takes training, discipline, and the money to buy and maintain the best weapons in the world. President Trump is now recognizing the point about money with his proposal for $1.5 trillion in defense spending in fiscal year 2027. Americans take for granted that the volunteer force will keep them safe, and the military's performance can create a sense of complacency about the world's threats. But deterrence isn't cheap, and adversaries who want to harm the U.S. are more determined than they've been since the end of the Cold War. The deterrent value of the Iran conflict will be determined by its outcome and the decisions Mr. Trump makes. But the performance of the U.S. military is reason to invest more to continue its record of success. From the opinion pages, I give up on these defeatists. From no kings in Iran to data centers, too many Americans are fighting progress. By Andy Kessler. I can't stand all the defeatism. After a few short weeks, multiple New York Times columnists used the word quagmire to describe Iran. Really? No navy, few launchers, dwindling missiles and drones, plus nukes under rubble. Yet the Guardian writes that the president has lost his Iran war. Who does this remind you of? Oh yeah, Baghdad Bob. Iraq's lying former information minister. Today the tide has turned. We are destroying them. Now the media appears to be taking on his role. Late capitalism, post-capitalism, America is in decline. Pronouncers, partisan professors, socialist mayors, ice out screaming celebrities. I'm tired of those rooting against us. Add the Tucker Carlson wing of isolationist and defeatist who would leave terror-funding despots in power. Don't give up on democracy. Last month saw more critics mangling No Kings rallies, at least 3,300 of them in all 50 states. Even one in London where it had to be branded No Tyrants, since they have an actual king. According to the permit for the march in St. Paul, Minnesota, why do so many weird things happen in Minnesota? Indivisible, a George Soros-funded political advocacy group, was the lead coordinator. Other rallies were funded by socialist and communist revolutionary organizations, according to Fox News Digital. Classic AstroTurf. Be careful who you march for. I'm all for protest. It's our right as Americans. But nailing down the reason for no kings is more like spinning the wheel of defeatist complaints. Signs noted fascism, wars, school funding, billionaires, LGBT issues, allowing illegal immigration, even the Epstein files. And really, the rallies are mostly about Donald Trump's winning the election. Forget protest. They're more of a massive primal scream therapy session. The New York Times recently ran a 4,100-word diatribe of defeatism, beginning, "We had a good run," before taking a swan dive into the mock, including this economic gem. Quote, "The benefits of globalization had been vastly oversold." End of quote. Did you type that on a MacBook or a Remington typewriter? Thought so. After a decades-long push for green energy, California has some of the highest electricity prices in the U.S., and now $6.50 a gallon for premium gasoline, despite plenty of retrievable oil. We've been gored. The same folks pushing those policies now circularly complain about affordability and the failure of capitalism. How bizarre. Their defeatism was self-induced. Remember the nail biting that our fragile planet couldn't handle multiple American standards of living around the world? It happened. We're okay. The better they do, the better we do, selling them our high-value intellectual property. If you haven't figured it out, the main export of the U.S. is our standard of living. It isn't in decline, but the envy of the world, hence the rush to our borders. You won't find that export in economic statistics, but it drives demand for our technology, medical practices, and more. The other thing we export is freedom, which drives innovation and lifts living standards elsewhere. Global growth and productivity will be so strong that we're rapidly inventing robots and artificial intelligence to handle logistics. Meanwhile, many fight progress at home. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, Charter members of the Socialists for Defeatism Society want a moratorium on productivity driving artificial intelligence data centers. They really do hate us. I'm mostly tired of whiners who see defeat behind every minor setback. Sure, hate the president all you want. I have my own grievances to air. But give him credit. He threw out defeatism and acted when everyone else waffled. Mr. Trump didn't kick the can down the road by meekly lobbing a missile or two into Iran, like Bill Clinton in Iraq or Barack Obama in Libya. Heck, Mr. Obama, along with sidekick Ben Rhodes, returned a $1.7 billion tall boy can to Iran. This in exchange for quickly ignored sanctions, making Iran the power keg that it was before February 28th. Whatever happened to Harry Truman's "The buck stops here"? Well, it's back. Mr. Trump opened up a can of whoop gas, blowing up drug boats, arresting Nicolas Maduro, and with Israel vaporizing terrorist funding mullahs. All a great start. The 3D chess match continues. Now what? Because of defeatism, we don't follow through. No more of Woodrow Wilson's making the world safe for democracy. A shame. Maybe the Trumpian way is to make the world safe. I wish we'd finish the task and encourage democracy. Democracy is worth fighting for. Maybe we can't force it. Purple fingers after voting in Iraq, but we can be ready to pounce. The Middle East is transforming. Someday the masses in China will demand a political say now that they have an economic say. Same with a post-Vladimir Putin Russia. Global growth will be hard to hold back, but the world needs to be safe first, and safe from defeatist. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Voting in California. All in favor, say ARF. An Orange County dog was allowed to cast a ballot, and Democrats try to stop a voter ID initiative. By Alicia Finley. Democrats in Sacramento have sought to ease voting requirements to the maximum extent possible. The result? Even pets have managed to cast ballots, or at least their owners have on their behalf. A woman from Costa Mesa, California, was charged last fall with illegally registering her dog, Maya, to vote and submitting ballots on the canine's behalf. The dog's vote was successfully counted in the 2021 gubernatorial recall election, but was rejected in the 2022 primary, the Orange County District Attorney's Office said. An ID isn't required to register or vote in California elections in which federal offices aren't contested, such as the 2021 gubernatorial recall. An ID also isn't required to register in federal elections. Californians who don't provide an ID when they register must present documentation when they vote in a federal election for the first time. But acceptable forms of ID include a drug prescription, a gym card, and even a sample ballot sent to the registrant's home. California law says its voter ID rules should be liberally construed to permit voters and new registrants to cast a regular ballot. If a voter's eligibility is in doubt, local officials aren't allowed to throw a ballot out. Local election officials also aren't required to verify that a voter is a citizen or even exists. The Orange County District Attorney notes that the defendant posted on social media in October 2024 a photograph of Maya's dog tag and a vote by mail ballot with the caption, "Maya is still getting her ballot, even though the dog had previously passed away." The canine fraud was discovered only because the woman reported herself to the county registrar. Some localities in California have sought to impose stricter ID requirements, but the legislature in 2024 passed legislation preempting them. California's loosey-goosey voting rules practically invite fraud, much like its generous welfare programs and transfer payments. During the pandemic, the state paid an estimated $30 billion in fraudulent unemployment claims, including to state prisoners and criminals who used patently false identities, like then Senator Dianne Feinstein and Mr. Poopy Pants. The number of hospice companies in Los Angeles County has increased by 1,500% since 2010, with 89 registered in a single building. Yet such flagrant signs of fraud didn't raise alarms with state officials who are in charge of regulating hospices. Voter fraud in California may not be prevalent, but it's surely more common than in most places. The potential for fraud in California is compounded by laws that let people register on Election Day and cast provisional ballots. Third parties are also permitted to turn in ballots, which are mailed to every registered voter. A reader in Los Angeles sent me a photo of 2 ballots he received for last November's special election on a referendum to redraw the state's House map. How many other Californians received more than one ballot? Who knows? And do Democrats care? Their goal is to make it easier for union and left-wing groups to turn out low-propensity Democratic voters. Unions often conduct voter registration and ballot drives at work sites that employ large numbers of non-citizens, including farms, hotels, and healthcare facilities. Are they asking employees whether they are citizens before helping them register and vote? Probably not. Union opposition to a proposed ballot initiative that would require election officials to verify voters' citizenship is telling. The initiative, which backers say has enough signatures to qualify for the November ballot, would also require voters to present a government ID at the polls, or the last 4 digits of a government ID when voting by mail. Such requirements are much less onerous than President Trump's SAVE Act, which would require proof of citizenship to register and a photo ID to vote. Even liberal Californians support ballot integrity rules in principle. A Berkeley IGS poll last May found that 71% of voters, including 59% of Democrats, support requiring proof of citizenship when registering to vote for the first time. Yet Democrats are seeking to undermine the ballot initiative with legislation that would allow voters to challenge election rules by alleging that they result in voter suppression. They hope state courts will keep the stricter voting rules off the ballot, which is what happened to a citizen initiative in 2024 that sought to make it harder to raise state and local taxes. California's direct democracy originated during the early 20th century progressive era to allow citizens to bypass the legislature and enact reforms. But Democrats have effectively rigged the rules. Example, limiting initiatives to general elections when Democratic turnout is typically higher, to entrench one-party rule. Watch out, if they win complete control of Washington, they'll try to impose California-style lax election rules nationwide with the goal of cementing their power. Europe looks away from troubling signs in Ukraine. The continent's leaders, seeking a buffer against Russia, ignore perils to democracy in Kyiv, by Alexander Rodniansky. Europe's policy toward Ukraine is becoming more candid in private, even as it grows more guarded in public. Publicly, European leaders describe their support for Ukraine in moral and ideological terms, pitting democracy against authoritarianism, sovereignty against imperial conquest, and the rule of law against brute force. True, Russia's invasion is an act of aggression, and Ukraine has every right to defend itself. But that isn't the whole story. In some of my closed-door conversations with Europeans, a harder logic is increasingly dominant. Their support for Ukraine is no longer primarily about solidarity with a fellow democracy. It's about buying time for themselves. That logic is understandable. Europe fears that if Russia emerges from the war less constrained, more confident, and no longer tied down militarily, the threat to the rest of Europe will increase. Reuters captured this last year when it reported that most European Union countries believe that as long as Russia remains militarily engaged in Ukraine, it is less likely to attack an EU member. In other words, Europe sees Ukraine not only as a nation to be saved, but as a buffer to be maintained. The problem isn't that Europe has interest. Every serious foreign policy begins with interest. The problem is that Europe refuses to be forthright about the nature of its own strategy. Europe wants the strategic benefits of using Ukraine as a shield while continuing to speak as though it is engaged chiefly in a noble democratic mission. That deception is becoming dangerous. It encourages European governments to judge Ukraine by its willingness and ability to keep fighting to the exclusion of any criticism of the quality of the Ukrainian state. So long as the front holds, almost everything else becomes easier to rationalize. Coercive mobilization, executive overreach, suspended accountability, corruption that remains endemic, incompetence and political dysfunction in Kyiv. The moral narrative remains intact, and the harder questions are deferred. Defensive wars don't merely protect states, they also deform them. Ukraine is showing signs of that strain with the growing standoff between the presidency and parliament, the difficulty of converting presidential will into legislation, and the fiscal fragility exposed by Ukraine's reliance on external financing. An International Monetary Fund mission was in Kyiv in March as lawmakers struggled to pass unpopular tax measures tied to a new IMF program, and Ukrainian officials warned that missed commitments could jeopardize billions in external support. This is evidence of institutional stress in a state fighting for survival. Europe should be more concerned about this. A country can survive militarily while decaying politically. That is one of the classic dangers of long wars of attrition. They tend to centralize power, normalize coercion, and create powerful incentives to postpone scrutiny in the name of necessity. The issue doesn't disappear simply because Western politicians find it inconvenient to acknowledge. This is important because Ukraine's trajectory is unfolding in a world where democracy is already under pressure. The 2026 Democracy Report from VDEM, a think tank based in Sweden, says a third wave of autocratization is deepening and that the average person's level of democracy worldwide has fallen to roughly 1978 levels. Freedom House reported a 20th consecutive year of global decline in freedom. In such an environment, it is especially reckless to assume that war, no matter how justified, will somehow purify institutions rather than corrode them. The European bet seems to be that these distortions can be managed later. That is a wager, not a strategy. If the current trend continues, Europe may not end up with the inspiring post-war democracy it imagines. It could instead inherit a heavily armed, deeply traumatized, politically brittle country on its border, one that is anti-Russian but not liberal, well-governed, or easy to integrate. Ultimately, the risk is that prolonged war and indulgent external backing produce a state whose pathologies are dangerous in and of themselves. That possibility remains taboo in many European circles. It shouldn't be. It isn't anti-Ukrainian to say that democratic decay matters in Ukraine. None of this means Europe should abandon Ukraine. A stable and genuinely sovereign Ukraine remains in Europe's interest. But if Europe wants to support Ukraine as a future member of the West, rather than merely as a glacis against Russia, its policy has to change. That starts with honesty. Europe should admit that self-preservation is now a central motive of its support. It should also stop treating military endurance as the only measure that matters. Aid should be tied to battlefield needs and to institutional development, legislative function, transparency, anti-corruption enforcement, competence rather than the blind celebration of supposed political savvy, limits on arbitrary power, and a clear understanding that wartime necessity cannot become a permanent political principle. Otherwise, Europe risks creating the very outcome it claims it wants to avoid, a source of instability on its frontier. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 6, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal.